right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski, and I am here with Katrina Fuentes. Katrina is one of the fellows for the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. She's graduating soon with a double major in biology and theology. And for the center's fellowship program, she did a project titled The Reinterpretation of Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 1 through 6 in Christian Zionist Eschatology. This is a really excellent research paper that she did. I'm happy to be talking with her today. So, Katrina, what got you interested in this project?
Of course, yeah. So it was kind of took me a while to reach this exact thing that I wanted to write about. I originally, when I first came to the fellowship, I wanted to do something about Jewish life in small town America, and then I kind of found that they didn't have a ton of things for me to really dig into there. And so gradually I started shifting towards more of a Christian analysis of Christian Zionism, but originally, my essay was very focused on this idea of like a current and non-occurrent belief, where when something sort of is at the forefront of your mind, you're thinking about it a little bit more, you're kind of more attached to it. But as I started to kind of formulate my essay to find sources and to find things I wanted to talk about, I really started shifting towards biblical prophecy as kind of a big reinterpretive lens to take with this project. And I
Mhm.
particularly started focusing on Ezekiel 38, 1 to 6, which is in the book of Ezekiel, it's a kind of list that God is giving Ezekiel of future enemies of Israel. And in the sources that I was reading, I was starting to find this really interesting kind of constant reinterpretation of these figures based on sort of what's going on in the world at the time. And I really kind of jumped into that. I got super interested in that. There was so much information for me to sort of dig into there. And that's kind of where my project got to.
Great, great. And so, can you give us a little bit more background just on this question of Christian Zionism, what it
Mhm.
is, and in particular, the way in which like apocalyptic thinking is an important part of Christian Zionism?
Yeah, so Christian Zionism is kind of like what it says on the tin. It's Zionism, but practiced by Christians. And there's a lot of different forms of Christian Zionism, but the one that I primarily focused on was this sort of apocalyptic dispensational form of Christian Zionism, where there's an idea in some evangelical American groups that the existence of the state of Israel is in some way fulfilling biblical prophecy. And
Hmm.
so it is the duty of Christians to sort of support the state of Israel because through that, you're sort of supporting God's work and you're also supporting God's ultimate plan for humanity.
Hmm.
And that's kind of where the apocalyptic thought sort of fits into it, where it's not a purely kind of political support for the state of Israel. It's also very much seeped in like religious beliefs, like regarding the rapture, regarding things like the Great Tribulation, all of this end times prophecy stuff.
And so part of what you really honed in on, as you already said, was that there's this passage in Ezekiel chapter
Hmm.
38, verses 1 through 6, that becomes really significant for this pattern of thinking, especially
Hmm.
among American evangelical Christian Zionists. So can you tell us a little bit more about what Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6 simply says or is doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have it right up. I have it up right now. So Ezekiel, as people watching this probably know, is kind of just a book filled with a whole bunch of prophecies about Israel, about all these things given to the prophet Ezekiel. And in this chapter, sort of God has come to Ezekiel and he's telling him about a future war that is going to be happening between Israel and the enemies of Israel. And Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6 is kind of literally just like a list of these enemies. So you have like Gog, you have Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, all of his bands. And yeah, it really is just kind of a big list of enemies. And because
Mhm.
it's sort of this list of enemies where some of them are kind of it's sort of not apparent to some people like what these names are supposed to be referencing. Like it's hard to kind of pin down a lot of these nations as like, okay, this is this and this is this, sort of in like the historical record. And so because there's this timelessness to these names where they don't have very firm identities, like in the biblical text, it's been very easy for a lot of these like sort of Christian Zionist apocalyptic thinkers to take these names and sort of apply it to whatever they think is relevant at the current time.
And are there particular lists of these enemies or particular names of enemies that are especially utilized in this kind
Yeah.
of interpretive framework?
So Gog and Magog are kind of like the big ones because Gog and Magog are put at the very top of this little passage. They're kind of presented as the leaders of this coalition that's going to be attacking Israel sometime in the unknown future. And so these are the figures that these writers really, really love to focus on. There's often kind of a laser focus on these guys, and the other allies that are mentioned of of Magog and Gog are they're always related to whatever the author thinks that Magog is. So
Mm,
Gomer is one that I really focus on in my essay, and
mhm,
Gomer has a very, very small part in a lot of these ideas about the apocalypse, but I just found Gomer so fascinating because Gomer is really indicative of this tendency to just sort of switch things up depending on what you think Magog is.
mm,
For
mhm.
example, in the Cold War era, which I believe we'll be getting to in a little bit, the USSR was seen as Magog, and so Gomer was seen as Germany and also just kind of generally all the Eastern Bloc nations. Just that arbitrary border is like that's Gomer. That's what the Bible literally thinks is Gomer.
Okay, great.
But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Is there more you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention, so after the fall, like after the fall of the Soviet Union, end of the Cold War, Gomer kind of shifts very much to being a Muslim state, but we'll get into
Okay.
that a little bit later.
Okay, good, good, good. Yeah, that's so. Yeah, this is really interesting that you have these kind of ambiguously named enemies, and then the argument of your paper is that the priorities of various interpreters determine the identification of these
Hmm.
enemies. And so one of the people you start with talking about is, I believe, Darby.
Yes.
John Darby. So you argue that he's sort of at the source of the
Hmm.
ways of reading Ezekiel 38 and this modality. Can you say a little bit
Hmm.
more about who Darby is and why he matters for what comes later?
Yeah, so Darby was actually a European theologian. Sources differ on if he was English or Irish, but
Hmm.
he was part of this group called the Plymouth Brethren, I believe, and he sort of popular like he didn't originate these kinds of thinking about the Bible, but he really popularized it. And he did a couple of tours of the United States, I think, in the late 19th century. And so while it really didn't explode until a little bit later, he really, like in coming to the United States, he kind of popularized this way of thinking. He sort of put it into, he sort of began to put it into the American theological consciousness almost. And what
Hmm.
Darby's most famous for is really popularizing the idea of the rapture. So the idea that at the end times, sort of the true followers of Christ will be brought up
Hmm.
to meet with Jesus in the sky. And then
Hmm.
after that, there's going to be a period of 7 years of the Great Tribulation where all these horrible things will happen until at the end of those 7 years, like Jesus comes back and destroys all evil and it's
Hmm.
beautiful forever. And the millennial kingdom is established. And this is super linked to another thing that Darby really kind of started to popularize, which is the idea of dispensationalism. So
Hmm.
the idea that God works with humanity in several different ways throughout time, and that the Bible has seven of these different ways of dealing with humanity, these different eras that are called
Hmm.
dispensations. And Darby identified seven of these, and he also said that we're very close to the final one, which is the Great Tribulation, the end of days.
Hmm.
And so Darby, I believe, was important for really kind of planting the seeds of this theology in the United States, but it was the Scofield Reference Bible
Hmm.
that was published in 1909, I believe, that really kind of blew this up into a huge thing. It was a hugely commercially successful, especially for a book written or a book published in 1909. It was hugely
Hmm.
commercially successful. And I honestly think combined with the things that were sort of happening in the early 20th century, like the Great Depression, the First World War, like the Spanish flu outbreak, I really do
Hmm.
believe that all of these things kind of contributed to that popularization. So it really was a confluence of factors that sort of all together brought this sort of dispensational way of thinking, really
Hmm.
like in like made it a huge thing.
Right. And so part of what you're signaling also is that even though they're calling upon these ancient prophecies, it's really very modern, contemporary
Yeah.
concerns that drive this reading as well. And so turning to that, so one of your core arguments is the ways in which Ezekiel 38, chapters 1 through 6, is interpreted, especially the identification of these various enemies who might represent nations or
Mhm.
kingdoms. This depends a lot on geopolitical events. So,
Mhm.
who are some authors that you discovered that illustrate this trajectory?
The first author I talk about in my paper after the section on John Darby is this author named Harry Reimer, who was writing in the 1940s, so beginning of World War II, excuse me, but before the United States enters into the war. And reading his work was very interesting, kind of just to see, because right now, at that point that he was writing, World War II was still very much like the European war. It wasn't really
Hmm.
a global conflict just yet. And so it's very interesting to see how he kind of sees what the purpose of the war is. And what he thinks is that the Second World War is not the War of Armageddon that will end the world, but it is sort of setting up for that.
Hmm.
And he has a lot of things that he posits are going to happen, which will eventually lead to like the War of Armageddon. And one of the big things is the rise of Russia as sort of the global superpower. He thinks that even though the Russians and the Germans currently had a non-aggression pact, that they were going to betray each other, and Russia was sort of going to steamroll Germany and then sort of be the dominant power in Europe. A little thing that he mentions that I always found very entertaining is that there's some line he says that owing to the horrible performance of the Italians in the war, they're probably just going to lose all of their African colonies, and that's going to lead to, I think it was Ethiopia and Libya being free for Russia to kind of take control over, to, like exert influence over.
Hmm.
And so Reimer is the first author that I was really focusing on as very much seeing what was going on in the world, seeing what was going on in Europe, and saying this is almost directly going to be like it's going to be a direct contributor to the end of days. Like this is
Hmm.
what's happening right now is biblically mandated. It is happening so that these things can be set up.
Right.
And as will be seen like several times throughout this, he identifies Magog as Russia. He sees it like as
Hmm.
long and bloody
Hmm.
history. He sees it as a godless nation.
Hmm.
And yeah, and going back to what I mentioned about Gomer being kind of very nebulous when it comes to this,
Hmm. Hmm.
Reimer identifies Gomer as a very vague Balkan people. It's like, oh, we have
Hmm.
these Balkan peoples. They're similar enough to Russia. They'll probably just all go to Russia. So, and
Interesting.
it's a very, very interesting statement to make. He probably doesn't know a lot about Balkan peoples, but yeah, and so it's kind of the first example I found of Gomer sort of just being whatever it needs to be, whatever it's most convenient to be, whatever an author thinks is will be most easy for them to sort of go be allied with Russia, or whatever they think Magog is. And so Reimer was the first author I really looked at, and then the second author I really looked at is who I think is kind of the poster child of this type of theology. We have Hal Lindsey, probably
Hmm.
the most famous author I discuss in the paper. The rest of the authors I discuss, some of them have Wikipedia pages, but a lot of them are more kind of unknown, a little bit less
Hmm.
information on them. But Hal Lindsey had a ton, he wrote a ton, he's very famous. The people watching probably know his book, The Late Great Planet Earth, published in 1970, which really kind of exploded this sort of idea onto the scene.
Right.
And Lindsay is writing in a very Cold War context, in an
Hmm.
extremely Cold War context. It's the 1970s. Cuban Missile Crisis was only a couple years ago. Things are still very hot in the Cold War. And he is very much of the opinion that all of the enemies that Ezekiel mentions in Ezekiel 38, those are all sort of communist nations. Communism is this great evil. It is sort of this biblically mandated evil that is contrary to Western values, contrary to like Christian values, contrary to Judeo-Christian values.
Hmm.
And he keeps with Reimer's idea that Russia is Magog, but now things are very much seeped in sort of communist ideology, you know?
Okay.
So USSR is Magog, and the allies of the USSR, those are all communist nations. Once
Okay.
again, bringing up Gomer, as I mentioned before, Gomer is now not just Balkan peoples. He explicitly identifies it as East Germany, like the very arbitrary border of East Germany.
Right.
That is
Right.
what Ezekiel was talking about. Like all the Iron Curtain East, that is all Gomer. And it was just very interesting to read that the first time because it was so indicative of what I was trying to see. Like, it's not all the time that you have a thesis and then you read something and it's kind of literally just stating your thesis at you, you know?
Right.
And
Right.
so, yeah, those are the two authors I really focused on at the beginning of the paper. And Lindsay, again, is kind of the poster child for this. Even as we go forward into after the Cold War, he will continue to sort of reinterpret his own writings to
Right.
better fit with what's going on with him, what's going on in the world currently.
Good, good. Yeah, and so this is really interesting. So to show this trajectory that like Reimer signals that like Russia is going to be this enemy. But then you argue the Cold War context supercharges that
Hmm.
identification for Lindsay, and that
Yeah.
also because that supercharging that also then informs Lindsay's re-identification of
Hmm.
Gomer as well. And
Hmm.
so it sounds like what you're saying is Gomer just sort of floats. It's a
Yeah.
floating signifier. It moves to whatever needs to be
Yeah.
indicated to support the overarching interpretive framework.
Yeah, it's very much a nation that I think I read somewhere that authors sometimes seem simply not to know what to do with it.
Hmm.
Especially it makes a little bit of sense in I guess the way that this theology can make sense that Lindsay thinks that Gomer is East Germany because historically there had been some mumblings about Gomer being in some way equivalent to Germany. But even beyond that, he sort of takes that idea that Gomer is East Germany and then sort of just applies it blanketly to every single sort of Eastern Bloc nation.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
So the Soviet Union collapses in
yeah.
1989. So what happens to this, um, maybe broadly, this way of reading scriptures apocalyptically and prophetically, but then
Hmm.
how does this show up in the ways in which the readings of Ezekiel 38 also?
Hmm.
It seems like
Yeah.
world circumstances requires something to be done here.
Yes. So Lindsay, for his part, I think at least up until 1994, he was saying that the fall of the Soviet Union was Gorbachev's trick, that
Mm,
it actually didn't fall, that Gorbachev had like secret plans and everything was still going to advance as he had predicted previously. So obviously this did not happen. There was no Gorbachev's trick.
mhm,
And I note this in the paper that you really do think that something this catastrophic to this ideology would really like destroy it because so many of these writers were so focused, laser focused on the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union is a godless entity. It is contrary to Christianity, to Judeo-Christian values. The Soviet Union is going to try and destroy Israel and be destroyed. Like this was what the the interpretations were about. Like this is very much what it was. And now suddenly, prematurely and seemingly without God's input, the Soviet Union collapses. It is no more.
mhm,
What are you supposed to do about that? And what happens is there's a very marked and very rapid shift from the idea that communism is this big evil that is going to sort of try and strike at Judeo-Christianity, and now it's Islam. There's almost like
mm,
an immediate shift from communism to the idea that Islamic radicals, which a lot of these writers seem to think just constitutes all of Islam, is this ultimate evil. And so we get
mhm,
Lindsay saying this in his 1994 book, which is called, I think it's Planet Earth 2000 AD, Will Humanity Survive? And
mm,
while he's
mm,
still kind of focused on the Soviet Union, he still sees Russia as this kind of evil. He
mhm,
starts focusing a lot more on the idea of like Iran, like these Muslim nations. He starts kind of drumming up this fear of like this radical Islam that's coming for Western values, that's coming for Judeo-Christianity. And
mhm,
with this
mhm,
comes a bit of a polemical shift as well when it comes to Israel. We haven't talked about it much, but Israel is very, very central in these theologies. The whole idea is that these enemy nations are going to try and attack Israel, and that's going to start the end times.
mm,
And
mhm,
so while something I noted when discussing sort of the communist side of it, so during the Cold War, is that it almost seemed that these communist nations, they were going to attack Israel just kind of out of obligation. It was just going to be a thing that happens because it has to happen. I think
mm,
the justification that Reimer and Lindsay use is that the Dead Sea has a lot of minerals, and somehow in the future, Israel is going to develop technology to extract those minerals and become super wealthy. And then because of that wealth, like these nations are going to attack. That was the justification.
mhm,
But once you get to like a Cold War era, it stops being kind of just it stops being this idea that oh they're just going to do it for the wealth or they're just going to do it kind of because they have to.
mhm,
When the focus shifts to Islam, it becomes very much like Muslims have an inherent hatred of Jewish people. It stops
mhm,
being kind of an impersonal thing. It starts being extremely, extremely personal that All Muslims hate Israel. They all hate Jewish people and they all hate the West. And because of this almost like ontological evil that is applied to this group, they are going
Mhm.
to be attacking Israel. And so that's kind of the major, major shift I saw. And the most interesting shift I saw, where despite both of these sides still being presented as these ontological enemies,
Mhm.
the reason that they're the enemies, it really shifts. And it's a really interesting thing to see.
Mm, mm, mm. So this is, it's fascinating because this really follows the trajectory of also conservative American politics
Mm,
of focusing on the Soviet Union as a threat and communism as a threat to pivoting to this
mm,
highlighting of Islam as a threat, and Islamophobia that circulates. And we see this kind of accelerating after 9/11 and things like this. So that really brings us to the 21st century.
mm.
So what are the legacies or what's happening right now?
Yeah.
Have things shifted? Are the Christian Zionist interpretations of Ezekiel 38 following Lindsay's patterns that you note start in the mid 90s, or are we seeing other iterations developing right now?
Yeah. So sort of starting in the mid 90s, there was as we said, there was a shift from the idea of communism to Islam as this big threat. But particularly, there was a big shift from Russia to Iran. Russia was still very often stated to be Magog, like Russia still had a role in all of this. But
Hmm.
it very much became that Russia was kind of being manipulated by Iran. Like, even though Iran wasn't sort of the headlining name in Ezekiel 38, it was. Oh no, even though Russia was the headlining name in Ezekiel 38, it didn't really have any autonomy in what it was doing because then the idea became that Iran was sort of going to put the hooks in Magog's jaw and sort of lead them to it, kind of like strong arm them into this. So really,
Hmm.
despite almost what the biblical prophecy says, it's really going to be Iran that has this big role. And so that's sort
Hmm.
of what's happening in the early 90s and sort of going sort of through the 2000s, especially after 9/11. But the last section of my paper, I really discuss the effects of October 7th, 2023 on this sort of idea
Hmm.
of like Ezekiel. And you definitely still have this focus on radical Islam, which, as I said, is kind of seen as all Islam by a lot of, like, there is no such thing as non-radical Islam to a lot of these authors. It's all just radical Islam.
Hmm.
So you still have that big focus on that, but instead of this sort of very like laser focus on Iran, you kind of get a shift towards Palestine as this big evil. And it's a very interesting thing because it almost feels like the role of Palestine in this is kind of shoved in there almost.
Hmm.
Palestine is, at least to my knowledge, from what I've read, was never really identified with Magog or any of the nations that
Hmm.
Ezekiel mentions, but just the act of this terror attack on Israel, it sort of refocused things and sort of made like, okay, now it's yes, Muslims, but also Palestinians in particular are really what is the focus of a lot of what's coming out now. And
Hmm.
something that really kind of affirms this is the work of Jonathan Cahn. So he is a messianic rabbi working out of New Jersey. And he wrote a book called The Dragon's Prophecy. And in this book, he posits this sort of idea that Palestinians, modern day Palestinians, are quite literally Philistines. They are modern day Philistines. They are the descendants of biblical Philistines. And because of this, and this kind of reflects the idea that all Muslims hate Jews inherently,
Hmm.
Palestinians have this kind of inner, like unremovable, it's like the kind of eternal enemies with Jews. So it's
Hmm.
Palestinians versus Jews. This is just how it works. Like ontologically, almost divinely, like this is just how it has to be.
Right, right.
And so there's really and also he says the Palestinians are being led by, just all of them are being led by Satan. And
Hmm.
so it's just very much like us versus them. There's no room for nuance in this kind of discussion. It very much is just, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. This is how it divinely is.
Hmm.
And yeah, really, and there was already sort of an othering that I was seeing throughout my research. So first was like communists in general, like that's the other.
Hmm.
And then sort of Muslims in general, that's the other. And then now we get to this where Palestinians are the other. They are
Hmm.
like the divinely mandated enemy. Their destruction is almost justified. Like the destruction of all of these enemies is is justified because ultimately God will be the one who do it. Like Jesus will come down and destroy all these enemies of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a very, very interesting thing to see. And that's kind of the trajectory that's going right now. You get a shift
Right.
from Iran to Palestine as kind of the big sort of centerpiece of this theology. And
Mm.
it really is hard to see where it might be going next. We're still very much in sort of the geopolitical situation where it does, at least to Americans, it does feel to some like radical Islam still is the biggest threat. And so it is
Right.
very difficult to see like kind of where this is going to go in the future. Because
Mm-hmm.
after all, the shift that like what caused the first shift from communism to Islam was kind of an insane like world-shaking event. Like the fall of the Soviet Union, nobody really thought that was going to happen like that quickly, kind of all just happened at once within the span of like 2 years. And
Right.
so because it's these giant geopolitical shifts that really affect what this theology produces, it really is hard to see like where could it possibly go next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And just to clarify, what happens to Gog and Magog in the past? We're recording in May of 2026, so we're about 2.5 years after
Mhm.
October 7th. Gog and Magog, are they being identified the Palestinians, or do they keep on floating here?
I think they're very floaty. I think so. I also talk a little bit in the paper about John Hagee, who does a lot of
Hmm.
sermons at the Cornerstone Church in, I believe it's in Texas.
Yeah,
And
San Antonio. Yeah.
yes. And he was also working, he still preaches, he was working, the sermons that I reference in the paper are pre and post October 7th.
Hmm.
And he still has some attachment to honestly, a lot of the prophecy that was going on in the Cold War, he still believes that Magog is Russia, especially after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He is very focused on Russia as Magog.
Hmm.
It's almost fascinating how little mention he really has of any of the more like sort of like traditional enemies that
Hmm.
this theology takes up after 9/11, especially. He really does not mention Iran. He doesn't mention Islam. It's kind of just, he's very laser focused on Russia. And very, very interestingly, he mentions in one of his very recent sermons, I believe 2022, that Germany is just Gomer again. He gives no explanation as to how this
Right.
happens, how Germany ends up allying with Russia. But it's a really interesting thing to note, and it really does feel that he's kind of still attached to a lot of a lot of this idea of Magog and Gog
Hmm.
from sort of Lindsay's works during the Cold War. And so that's his side of it. And even after October 7th, he's still very much for the idea that he's still very much into this theologizing about Gog and Magog.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
that sort of indicates that there's maybe differing schools of this premillennial dispensationalist interpretation around this passage from Ezekiel 38. But you're also perhaps suggesting that depending on what happens next in the next 10 years or so, we might see yet another iteration. But we also shouldn't be surprised that if we hear of these Christian Zionist apocalyptic preachers demonizing the Palestinian people, for instance, that we should not be surprised that you have exposed the ways in which there's an interpretive strategy that
Hmm.
takes into account current events and then applies it to the category of the prophetic.
Yeah. That's that's something I wanted to mention with Jonathan Cahn's book. He almost the entire book is just about Palestine. It's all about how Palestine is this kind of ontologically evil force. Like it's not
Mhm.
real, it's fake. It's just it exists purely due to anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
And sort of going back to your previous question, he is kind of very uninterested in Gog and Magog. He might
Mhm.
mention it like once or twice, but very much this whole book is about him trying to piece together the ways that like Palestine plays into this, which is it's just very interesting because it's not really something you see in any of the other authors, you know?
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
very much feels like something that is like laser focused on this current time, like this current moment. Like we had these horrible attacks in Israel, and now that's what everything has to be about. Like all along, it was
Mhm.
all about this stuff. And it honestly is a pretty strong break previous from previous thinkers because he's still working like surrounding his work around Israel, the importance of Israel for a very Christian conception of the end of days.
Mhm.
But he really isn't doing any of like the previous like the steps of the previous authors. Like there's no real focus on Gog or Magog. It's kind of it's just a very interesting book, I suppose you can call it.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting book the way it's mostly dedicated to just setting out the ways that he sees Palestine as being like this divinely mandated evil.
That's really helpful and probably a good place to land is just to have us see the ways in which biblical interpretation just has these shifting paradigms for meaning making that's really
Mhm.
informed by the contemporary concerns of these various preachers and writers. So thank you very much for this work and for the time of this
Thank
interview.
you.
It was great working with you on this project and to see this final product. So thank you very much.
Thank you as well. I had a really, really great time. Every time I would read something, I would go to my friends or my roommate and just talk about it for hours and hours. So it was a fun time. And now all my friends also know all about this stuff. So
Excellent. Well, thank you so much.